Well, hello,
Oh,
and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Tom O'Loughlin, who is Professor Emeritus of Patristics at Nottingham University. And we're here today with a slightly different video. Rather than telling you at great length about an early church father or text, we have a slightly different invite for scholars of you out there. Tom, why don't you pitch to the lovely viewers exactly what it is you're looking for and where this great idea has come from?
well, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for collaborators. And I'm looking for collaborators who not only want to translate Syriac, Greek, and Latin texts into English, but are also anxious to make them to make the translations in such a way that they will be useful to students. I'll give you an example. The two biggest series of patristic writings in English are Fathers of the Church. I'm sure many people know these covers, and Ancient Christian Writers. The problem with both of these is that they only come with an English text. Fathers of the Church, a very comprehensive range of texts, several hundred volumes. This is volume 140 that I just pulled off the shelf. Ancient Christian Writers, not as wide a coverage, but with lots of notes. And so, but that's all we have. If you're a classicist, of course, for over 100 years, you've got the lobes, the red lobes in Latin and the green lobes in Greek. And so we do have some patristic writers, like, for instance, this little translation of Boethius has been around since the 1920s. And it's much better because you've got Latin on this side, English on the other side. And even if you may not have the fluency to read the Latin straight, you can check what you're reading in the English and you can engage in a deeper engagement with the text. But look at other languages. Well, back in the middle of the Second World War, the French came up with the idea of source chrétienne. They already realized in the late 1930s that a generation of scholars and a generation of Christian readers had come up for whom Latin and Greek were just closed languages, and yet they felt that there was a richness in having the original text. And so they said they would produce new translations into French, but they would give the best Latin or Greek text. So this is a copy of St. Augustine's homilies on the Gospels of John. The tractates on John is what we call it in English. You have a splendid Latin text, much better than the underlying Latin text that was translated in the 19th century and is the only translation available in English. And then you have a French translation. But on the French side, you get explanatory notes. And at the back of the books, you get a very, very extensive set of notes. So Source Chrétienne were aware of a new problem back in the late 1930s, and by the early 40s, we're beginning this series. The problem that the group who ran and some and whose successors now run Source Chrétien was that they realized that translation was a twofold process. It's one thing to be able to translate Greek, Latin, and Syriac, right? That's okay. These are highly technical skills, but if you have them, you have them. But there's a second level of translation. You have to translate religious texts from one culture into another culture. And that's at three different levels. The first level is, imagine you're translating Didymus the Blind, writing in Greek in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. He's writing in the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, Egypt, but he's writing in Greek. So he's already slightly unusual within his culture. And he's aware of that tension. Now you have to take him out of late Roman culture and put him into the 21st century. That's a cultural translation that's far more difficult to do than moving him from Greek into English. Greek into English you can train, but cultural translation is the sensitivity of the historian, because, to use the jargon, the past is a foreign country. The second level is that many people today want to read these texts, but they don't read them as Christian insiders. This would be true of many of our undergraduates. They're reading these texts, but they don't have the biblical background, knowing the biblical stories, knowing all the in-house jargon. So you actually have to translate them in such a way that they're accessible to modern Christians. And the third level is these were all produced in a deeply religious culture. Everyone writing before the 16th century took a vast number of religious concepts for granted. And that would still be true until the Enlightenment, the early 19th century, and would still have been true to a certain extent, even well into the 20th century. But we live in a post-religious age, so we also have to translate religious notions in such a way that they're understood today. And this deep level of cultural translation always impressed me when I used source chrétien. And then the Germans, they realized the difficulty and they produced Fontes Christiani. So, for instance, here is the best Latin text of Abelard's great ethical work, Know Thyself, Scito Te Ipsum. A modern German translation, but as well as the modern German translation, a very good commentary that shows the difference between living in a post-Kantian world and reading a medieval author. So if you're trying to read Abelard today, and you have access to this book and German, you have an advantage that's denied everyone in English. I'll come back to this. Then the Spanish, Biblioteca Autores Cristianos, again, a massive publishing operation based in Madrid, taking all the great works. This is Egeria's Pilgrimage, Latin text on one side, Spanish on the other, and generous notes. So I thought, with a group of others, English is not only a language that's used by people in the British Isles and in North America and Australia, New Zealand, and here and there. It's now the most commonly used second language in the world. English is in a way the new Latin. And yet we are more poorly provided with patristic texts than the French, the Spaniards, or the Germans. And the same could be said for several other languages. So the idea was simple. Get access to the best text. Many of those, the copyright is already held by Brepols, so it made sense to go to Brepols to publish the series. And then produce a facing page Latin text. Here is a copy of a 2nd century text, the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi. Ignore the 16th century title, but this is the text that gives all the stories about the life of Mary, the mother of Jesus, that are familiar from European art and indeed from the Catholic liturgy. Things like the birthday of Our Lady, the names of our parents, Joachim and Anne, the story of their betrothal, all those stories are from this 2nd century text. So the late J.K. Elliott was producing a new critical edition of the Greek text, and that's what you get on this side of the page. And then a translation on that side. And then Patricia Rumsey, who had written a book on the Proto-Evangelium, produced a very elaborate commentary. Arnobius is one of those theologians that very few people have heard of. He's working in the aftermath of St. Augustine, and to distinguish him from another Arnobius, he's called Arnobius the Younger, Arnobius Junior. An awful lot of the arguments over grace and free will that are still debated today, but which were crucial in the 16th century, they don't come from Augustine himself. They come from this man, and yet he's hardly known. So we got an expert who works on the grace controversy, Guido Stucco, the new Latin text, new translation, and in this case, a very extensive introduction and notes, because the grace controversy, even though we still have to teach it, is so difficult for contemporaries to understand. And I showed you this book. This is Abelard, the same person who produced the German text has produced an English text. So this will be appearing in the series, Latin on one side, English on the other, and the notes in the next few months. So why am I talking to you this morning, Jack? If you think you could work on a text, translate it, but do this more deep type of translating, that you will translate linguistically, but also provide the notes and the introductions that are needed for readers today, I'd just love to hear from you.
There you go, folks. An invitation to translate, write notes, think critically about these texts, and make them accessible to 21st century people. And I think
accessible. That's the key word, accessible.
And I think it's an admirable task, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say, Tom, that I did my undergraduate more recently than you did. And when you begin
true, yeah.
When you begin your undergraduate studies, you don't begin with Greek or Latin. Indeed, even when you go to your postgraduate degrees, you don't have Greek, Latin, never mind Syriac. And so this sort of translation is not only imperative for helping younger scholars get into the field, work their way into languages and understand these early Christian texts, but I'd also say more widely for the general public who aren't going to study these things as in depth as we do, just to give them a flavor of the texts and the context they sit within. So, Tom, you mentioned to get in touch with you. How do we do that?
Email me at Nottingham, thomas.o'loughlin, all one word, at nottingham.ac.uk. But you look me up on the Nottingham website, and that's the easy way to get me.
Fantastic.
And if you don't have to come with a big fully worked out proposal, if you just have an idea, let's have a chat about it. There are some texts, there are no good editions. So there are some texts, there are editions, but you can't get copyright for them. And there are some texts where there are so many other problems, you can't tackle them. But this is a very good example. J.K. Elliott, everyone who has worked on New Testament manuscripts knows the late Keith Elliott as the person who kept track of all the different manuscripts and what was being written about them. He was a consummate Greek scholar, but he was not in any way confident about producing a theological commentary because that wasn't his skill. But Patricia Rumsey, that was her skill, and it was my job as editor to team these two people up. So if you have an idea, get in touch and we'll chat about it. Chat about it on Zoom.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for joining me this morning. It's been a pleasure. Please do reach out to Tom. I'll put his link to his university page down in the description for easy access. And in the meantime, see you soon. Bye bye.